Hey, what's up, guys? It's Reed Young for TransformPoker.com. I'm going to be reviewing a pretty sweet 6-max hand that I just found on the 2+2s. So, found yet again another hand to replay. So it's awesome. Yeah, while the pre-flop action's playing out, wanted to say if you guys want to post a hand to review or link a hand to review in the Facebook comment section, I will be more than happy to take a look at it. So if you guys click in the description on the Facebook link, and you can check out our page where we post a bunch of free strategy and stuff like that, post a hand there or link to a hand there, and I'll be happy to take a look at it. We can check it out for you guys. So you see we raised ace-jack offsuit under the gun in a 6-handed game. In some games that can be a little loose of a play, but I think, if you just look around the table at the varying stack sizes, there appear to be a few weaker players at the table, which really is more than enough to make me feel comfortable raising ace-jack offsuit. That might seem a little tight to you guys, but I think it's a worthwhile consideration if you have to worry about 5 different people re-raising you with a closer to optimal frequency, because that's going to be a lot of people to get through, and you have to get through not only their good hands but also their bluffs, where it's also going to be very difficult to navigate pre-flop play, let alone post-flop, especially if you're out of position. So we raise ace-jack, get called, get donked into on an ace-jack king rainbow board, which is kind of strange off the bat because our range is a lot more uncapped than the small blinds range is. So it's not traditionally going to be viewed as a great spot to donk. This is kind of more like donking into someone on like ace 4 or 5. It's just like, why would you do it? Because they're going to continuation bet most of the time anyway. So usually it's kind of like a social contract almost. I don't know if that's the right phrase for it, but it's kind of like an unspoken agreement. Like, okay, you check, I'm going to bet because it works out for me a lot of the time, and then you can check raise because that might work out for you some of the time, and the math just continues from there, and people try to play a strategy against each other that way, because the best play from the pre-flop raiser is often to bet, and because of that, the best play from the small blind is often to check, unless he thinks he can exploit some other dynamic where the pre-flop raiser is going to play pretty poorly. So right off the bat, getting donked into here should set off warning bells like, okay, this guy's doing something exploitive against us. Whether or not he is thinking about it in those terms, I don't think is very important. But intuitively, I believe that the small blind is at least thinking that what's happening here is there are a lot of hands where we might call 3 times since we've been led into, and it doesn't make much sense for him to lead a strong hand here. So there's a lot of hands where we might call 3 times, but we might not bet those hands 3 times. So think about something like ace-6 suited. Maybe we would go ahead and bet on the flop and on the turn and then try to check back the river, trying to get value on the turn from something like king-queen. Now that might be a little bit thin on the turn for your taste, but the example is kind of the point of it. So he leads into us probably as a bluff or with something extremely strong. So we're not really expecting that many hands that are worse than like ace-queen, for example, in his value range. And since most people do lead here, or if they're trying to lead, it's often with something with a little bit of equity. There just really aren't that many hands that have like equity that he probably thinks do better to lead for 3 streets than they would do by check calling. So stuff like Jack 10 has some equity, and it's tough to see a showdown by check calling. But I don't think a lot of people bluff with that type of hand when they should be. So I think his range is pretty strong here, is I guess what I'm getting to. Even though he bets closer to half pot, I think you could see that as a bet designed to induce a raise from hands in our range like ace-jack. But given what we think about his range and how polarized it is anyway, I think raising is a mistake. So I'm happy to see that the poster of the hand just flatted. I think it's good without history, just kind of as the exploitive adjustment toward the overall field. Now, if you were facing someone who you thought had a closer to optimal leading range here, of course you do want to raise hands closer to the top of your range. And I'm not sure ace-jack is in the raising category per se, but it's got to be pretty close because really aces, you shouldn't expect to get a ton of action from worse hands since we don't expect him to have jacks or kings very often given the preflop action. Aces might not even be a raise since you just block all of the reasonable value hands, so a raise with aces would likely just fold out bluffs for the most part. And then you have kings, jacks, and ace-king, so you have a fair amount of combinations relative to the weaker made hands with which you could raise. So ace-jack is probably just right on the cusp of that, and again, for this hand, I think it's a call. On the turn, basically the exact same mentality, although I would expect his stronger hands to be betting a little larger here, so this looks a little blockery to me, like he's trying to see a cheaper showdown, or get some value from like king-queen or king-10 suited that we might have. So, his sizing again seems pretty exploitive, like he's just trying to manipulate our range with his bet sizing, which I think works against a lot of weaker players, but a stronger opponent is going to realize what you're up to and play accordingly. So I like to think we are on the stronger side of opposition, especially in a 50-cent $1 game. But I think calling here is fine for a few reasons, even though we kind of play into his game of blocking the turn. If we call here, we can represent hands like those king tens I was talking about earlier, and that might induce some river bluffs if he does have some sort of random hand like jack 10 that he's just decided he's going to 3-barrel with as a bluff. So in his mind, he might be trying to get us to call with a wide range on the turn, and then he's just going to blast the river with a bet and try to fold out all those hands. So not a bad strategy on his part, but I think if we have a very wide raising range on the turn, then all we end up doing is getting called by a better hand and then folding out all of those bluffs that are trying to bluff the river anyway. So we can just be content with calling and know that we probably have decent implied odds against his bluffing range, meaning that we're going to make more money from him bluffing the river than we would by raising for value and then getting a call from, likely a few, if really any, worse hands. I mean, maybe occasionally he'll have like ace-7 or a stubborn king-jack or something like that, but I don't think we're going to get a lot of value from raising here. So we flat. I think it's a great play. Now here is, I think, one of the more complicated parts of the hand. He checks the river to us. So all this stuff we've been saying about this hand is like, okay, if he's leading into us, it's kind of with the idea of trying to get 3 streets of value from something like ace-10 suited, where we might bet it twice on the flop and the turn, or put in 2 streets in some way. Maybe we check back the flop, and then we either bet when check 2 or call a bet, and then call another bet, or bet again when check 2 on the river. Either way, 2 streets go in. Or I guess the alternative would be like we bet the flop, we bet the turn, and then the river just goes check check because we think he's just not going to call with worse. And then by us betting the flop, it helps to protect our continuation bet bluffs that we want to make. So when he checks the river, I think what we're looking at for the most part here is an extremely polarized range, most of which is air. So by that I mean he is either checking a hand like his jack 10 where he's just like, well, screw this, now that spades got there, maybe we have a backdoor spade draw a bit more often than he does, in addition to our hands like ace-jack that probably won't fold to a bet, and all better hands, ace-king, jacks, kings, aces, all that type of stuff. The occasional ace-7 suited, I would imagine as well, maybe even ace-6. So when he checks to us on the river, I would say this is either him giving up or him trying to get very fancy with a flush that he somehow just hit. I don't think that's a large portion of his overall checking range, but if we do bet, I think the times that he's going to check raise as a bluff are almost never. Again, just kind of reacting to the average 50-cent $1 player. Then also, I guess like relative to the times he has a value hand, like a flush. So if we are doing the betting, then it's just very difficult for us to get value unless it's from picking off a check raise bluff. And because he's not bluffing, it just doesn't make sense for us to bet for value. So I think this is a pretty clear check back against most people. someone who's a bit more balanced might try to pick off a hand that you might be turning into a bluff in this spot, but I don't think anyone, for the most part, I mean, I'm talking up to like $5,000 behind games, would even be considering that type of action or taking this type of line. I think if they're betting twice, then they're betting the river a very, very high percentage of the time. And that's kind of going back to the turn where we talked about our implied odds in gaining a lot more value from actually just being able to call a river bet from a bluff. So when he checks, I think it's just a fine spot to check back, probably right on the cusp of things. As it is in the hand, we bet and we get check raised all in. I think the player with ace jack ends up folding, which I think is probably fine, but it's very difficult to say, and that's kind of the rough part about this hand, is we know that he should not be really check raising here for value, because his flop plan should have been to just bet 3 times for value and try to get value from those hands like ace-10 that might check back one street. Sometimes, once in a blue moon, maybe something like king-queen tries to hero call. But when he checks, we bet, and he raises, he should know that most of the time he's going to be facing a range of hands like ace-jack and better, and some of those hands include flushes that we can have. So for him to do this for value means he has an extremely strong hand, and because we think he's never doing it as a bluff, I think bet calling here would be a pretty horrible play. So I hope you guys enjoyed this hand. If you do, consider hitting that like button below the video, and sharing it on Facebook definitely also helps. So appreciate it, guys. If you have questions about it, I will see you in the comments section, and if you have a hand you'd like us to review, check us out in the Facebook comment section. Alright, take care, guys.